involved in kind of having this conversation with the VC and other administration staff. But what became very clear to us is that even at the highest levels of the organization, the vice chancellor and the chancellor, that there's so much pressure being put on these people who are honestly very, you can say, liberal-minded individuals. There's so much pressure being put on them that they cannot afford to protect our speech as much as it goes outside of the university. Within the university space, there can be as much freedom as you want, but not outside the university space. And maybe in that sense, a private institution is much more sanitized and secured. But as a person teaching in a public institution, what do you find? Do you find that fear much like something that infects you when you're teaching in like especially larger classrooms where you might not know all the students? I'm not talking about the smaller graduate classrooms where you know the students and you are confident that they will not, misinterpret you.
When I teach something called foundation course, where a course that can be taken by anybody in the university, from maths to management to even literary students, right? And I actually take it up as a political project because some 150 students can enroll, and I don't know the students, but one thing, this might sound very silly and I don't know what it might sound. One thing I do is I'm extremely kind and compassionate to students. Whatever question they may ask, whatever prerequisite knowledge they have, it's a genuine thing. I'm not saying I'm doing it as a very political strategy, but very genuinely I address the concern of students. So that means that students kind of are willing to listen, even if they don't agree to me. I think as a teacher, it is a very good tool in these times to be compassionate, not to be dismissive of students, whatever political, including I've had very strong ABP students in my class, but who would think twice before even countering me in the class. Not because I don't allow it, but I think they think twice. So in certain ways, I think this listening to students, not being dismissive of their political leanings or other interpretative ideas, helps me a lot. So that is one strategy I have used. But also outside of the class, I think what will help us as teachers of social science, as otherwise as well, talk to students, get to know them. All right? It's very important, whether it's a small class or a bigger class. Knowing the students actually helps. In the sense, what kind of, we don't have to be very curious or poke our noses into their personal affairs, but it is a process of knowing students, knowing people around them, and talking to them about it. I think that builds a very different kind of a understanding and tolerance to some extent.
Yeah, and I agree with you that it's important for teachers to be open to their students and to be able to show some kind of care, and that care in a certain way you receive that care back from them, whatever their affiliation or whatever their thoughts might be, right? And I feel like we don't have a lot of time right now, so I would like to open it up for questions or comments from the audience. Just a couple, I think. Sachidanand sir first, and then Rohit sir.
Anybody at the back?
Yeah.
I think some of
I think
from the back.
All scholars want to ask us.
Yeah, your mic is here.
It's an extremely interesting discussion, and I really like the nuanced responses which Soumya gave. There are 2 or 3 things that I will say, and some of them will answer the questions which have come up again and again. The first is the proposition that the blurring of the categories, discipline categories between history and other disciplines, it is a very welcome thing, and it is emancipatory. It has got emancipatory possibilities. The very blurring of categories is not really leading to the absence of political choices or the political agency. The question that was there again and again in your own mind. And this is because of the emergence of what is called the discourse and the going to the background of the traditional historiography. Traditional historiography today, according to the people who are working in the avant-garde sections, intersection between history and other disciplines, traditional historiography is passé. It is obsolete. What has replaced traditional historiography is the language turn in cultural analysis, namely the emergence of discourse itself. Now, with regard to the notion that if you have multiple historiography, does it lead to the absence of a kind of a stand in the political sense? The answer is no. And the answer is found in terms of the debates which are there in multiculturalism. The answer is that we do not have allegiance to only one entity, we have multiple allegiances. In the nation state and the transnational state also, there are always multiple allegiances. This is the answer which has been provided by Charles Taylor. So that is the first thing that I want to say. With regard to the unity and diversity, I would like to invoke U.R. Anantamurthy. And he said this unity and diversity problem. If you think of unity, diversity manifests itself. And if you put too much of pressure on diversity, unity also will manifest itself. So it is an ongoing kind of in the dialectics which is going on, and the answer is not in an exclusive sense. It is always multiple, and always multiple allegiances. And history is teaching us a lot, and I'm so glad that traditional historiography is obsolete, and emergence of historical consciousness is there in all disciplines, including in literature.
Yeah, I agree with you that the cultural turn that's happened over the last 50 years in the historical sciences is quite emancipatory. It's a very good thing for all of us because in that sense, the historical methodologies have become more flexible and they've allowed the incorporation of various other forms, as Soumya was talking about, various other forms within the traditional archive that existed. Now the question that remains to be answered, and which I think the contemporary historians will have to develop some answer to that, is in how far does this blurring of the disciplines leave history as an autonomous discipline intact, right? Does it then become absolutely immersed in the cultural and therefore requires its methodologies from disciplines like literature? Or does it manage to discover and develop new methodologies of its own that have come to be influenced by literary analysis and cultural analysis? Right? I think these are the questions that are open right now at this point. Yeah, sir.
No, go
No,
ahead.
there are many questions actually, and some of them worry me, but I'll ask only two. There are too many, so I'll ask only two. One is also might be a bit of clarification. I might have understood you wrong. You see, in your initial remarks, you said that through history we want to understand ourselves in a manner so that we move towards egalitarian society. I find this statement for writing history, I find this taking this assumption for writing history or say developing historical narrative very problematic. Why? You see, in 36, Zakir Hussain report says that we should write history in such a manner that the victory of peace and non-violence is shown, and that which is, love among people comes through the history. And rift, war, and violence is not mentioned that much. In the later part of 60s, we decided again to build nation through a historical narrative. And all this kind of purposes of history actually distort history. So I'm worried about that. could there be a possibility that we have some methodology which gives us a more reliable narrative, and the only commitment is to the truth? Is that possible? Now, I'm not saying I do know the truth as it is manifested in history, I do know that, but at the same time, express idea that through history I want to build a nation, I want to build non-violence, I want to build equalitarian society. Is that acceptable? Just one more thing. The second one, I might have again understood it wrong. You see, the local history, if you write, say, subaltern history, etc., so this is all right as long as the communities which are oppressed are right, and this could be taken up by the so-called oppressor or the more powerful people. I don't understand it. I mean, if a kind of historiography is right for the oppressed, this is right for the oppressor as well. This kind of thing, something is good for whom I don't mean you, historian, terms as oppressed, this is okay for you, but if the same methodology is used to whom the historian has dubbed as oppressor, then this is wrong. I think this is this has been the tone of this discourse, and I think that's not appropriate for history. Thank you.
Yeah, the first one you asked, can there be a reliable method for history that can express truth?
No, my question
No.
was, my question was in setting out the purpose. Should we try to approximate the truth best, or should we set a purpose of either building a nation or eulogizing non-violence or egalitarian society? Should we set that as a purpose? That's my question.
No, telling the history of a nation or narrating the nation, that's from a literary critic, Homi Bhabha, narrating the nation. Or the second purpose you said, no, I don't think, yeah, you're right, I agree with you, I don't think there should be a certain purpose in history. But what I meant to say is, history has always, even today, been written with that kind of a purpose. So when there is a purpose, there will be other purposes. But I'm also not very sure if our commitment should be for some abstract truth. Now I don't know what that is. Like I don't know what the purpose is, I also don't know what the truth is. So instead, that's one reason why I go back to orality, because I think if we tell our own stories, then there is a certain kind of thread that perhaps binds our stories. There is also a thread of truth in all our stories. So, but it's a very, very difficult task. I am not at all sure of this. But I mean by history, that is something that people have discussed in the first two sessions at least. But for me, for this discussion, how do we teach history and political science? I think it is very significant to understand what is the purpose and function of history. In order to understand how to teach it, why should we be teaching it? What is the purpose of history? So there's a whole lot of things that has gone on in the name of history, right? I would begin with an anecdote, my own experience, and then request Huzaifa to take over. I was in the high school. I grew up in Coorg, Kodagu, in southern Karnataka, a hilly place like this. We went on a trek, right? There's a nearby hill. We trekked, and from the top of the hill, the scene, as you know, is very mesmerizing. But a history teacher accompanied us. And this history teacher was from Tamil Nadu. That's a coincidence. But then, something which he said that day on top of the hill remained with me much, even today. It's been maybe 35, 40 years. He said, you people of Coorg, Kodagu, do not have any history. It's only the nature you have. Right? So that set me thinking later on, at that point of time, it disturbed us. But perhaps as a 8th standard student or a 9th standard student, there's no way of articulating what that disturbance was. But then, yes, it stuck, and I wrote about it much later. But then I think all of us can relate to this, right? When somebody asks you, tells you, you people don't have a history. It's not just me, it's a whole people as such. We don't have a history. Is that what history is? What happened to our history? Are we a historyless people? Right? So that's where I want to begin from. But I also want to just anchor in 2 points. So far, what has gone on in the name of history and what we teach in the class is entirely two different things, right? So people have become historyless, but still history is taught in schools. That's point number one. Second, history has largely been in the name of glorifying whatever idea we have of the nation at any point in time, right? Whether it is the current time or in the past, it's largely a glorification of nation, which is very selective, as we all know. We selectively erase some things and selectively incorporate certain other things. So history has always done this, not just now, all the time. So for me, given all these complications, history means understanding our society, not just past and not just numbers like many others have said, but understanding ourselves in order to move towards a more egalitarian society. That is the basic premise I'll work with in today's discussion, right? Towards a more egalitarian society in many ways. And I very much agree with what Ms. Prema said some time ago, that history should also teach us to care. Education system should be able to teach all of us to care for each other, right? So these are the three things I'll start with, and if Huzaifa wants to respond to these things or talk about what is history from his own viewpoint.
Yeah, thank you for, first of all, having me here. And secondly, I would also like to tell everyone that perhaps before we offer you food for your stomach, we might offer you some food for thought in this talk. So one thing which I would perhaps like to just begin with, and as someone from outside the historical discipline, one of the ways in which I'm looking at history right now, and I think maybe you can expand on this, is that the historical sciences are confronted by, you can say, a crisis of historical proportions. Right? You can think of the crisis as taking these four forms, and we can look at them in this way. The first of all is this kind of a removal or this flattening of history and mythology, which we see very clearly in India, especially with what happened with the Ram Janmabhoomi movement and the culmination that's happened this year. Right? We see that flattening of history and mythology happening. Secondly, there's this kind of loosening of the divide between facts and interpretation within the historical sciences. There is this inability to distinguish very clearly between what is a historical fact and what is a historical interpretation. Right? The third thing that we find, especially in India, is that there is a kind of inability to separate what happened historically with what is happening currently. So, for example, Muslims are demonized by being called the children of Babur or the children of Aurangzeb. Some things that happened 500 or 1000 or 1500 years ago, these are more relevant topics for, you can say, electoral, you can say, politicians, for, Twitter trolls, than things that are currently happening right now. And the fourth thing, which is also part of the crisis of the historical sciences, is that right now the distinction between nature and history, which you brought out, is also being, you can say, erased slowly because of the way climate change and global warming is affecting the very geological, you can say, cycles of the earth, right? So these four crises which we can map out for the historical sciences, how does that affect how, you can say, we teach or think about history, and especially when it comes to students who are much younger than the ones we are used to teaching, right? So, what do you think of these four real, crises for the historical sciences, and how do we tackle them?
I wish I had very concrete answers, but I wouldn't even attempt now. But maybe by the end of this discussion, now we can move towards how to address this crisis. But I will take two things that Huzaifa said, and then build on that for further discussion. Right. The first thing he talked about is a crisis between myth and history. Right? Where do we locate this? Right? And also, I would also connect this to the second point he made between fact and interpretation. Now, being from backgrounds that are not, we are not trained in historical methods, so to speak, but I would also like to point out that until the point that we can access written records, right, or archival methods of doing history, where have we sourced our history from? It is from epics to some extent, in all cultures, not just here. It is from cave paintings, it is from songs, it is from the archaeological findings, beads, pottery, etc., etc. So we have woven history through various sources. It's only now that there is a problem with understanding history. Of course, people do history, but do history through various modes, but also accepting other performative and oral modes of doing history. So, but what is myth? What is history? There is a huge. It's much more a political thing than a historic, the method of history, right? Flattening the difference between what is myth and what is history is a political project and not a historical project. And these two projects, I would again emphasize, this is not a new thing, conflating myth and history, or the role of politics in understanding history. During monarchic times, pre-monarchic times, you have histories recorded in temples or places of worship inscribed as patronized by the king, right? It is only when we move out of this patronized idea of history can we look into other kinds of history, that also how to bring this into the school. Maybe we can talk about it as well. So fact and interpretation is also another thing that being literary scholars, we always talk about how literature is a narrative, but history is also a narrative, right? History is narrated by somebody. I mean, all of us know this these famous words. History is the words of the victor. So history is a narrative of one kind. It's an interpretation of one kind. And the question which Ms. Prema had for us, one of the pointers she had sent us was, what does it take for teachers of history and political times, in such political times, to teach when subjects are misunderstood and often rewritten, right? So the assumption here, as I said, is that history is a written project. What I want to go back to say is, history is an interpretative project. It's always interpreted by whom it is written, or by whom it is drawn, or by whom it is said, whom it is sung, whatever it is, right? So instead of making history a written project, but in schools, of course, we study history in the written form. We'll get back to it. But interpretation has everything to do with history. History has everything to do with interpretation, and what is fact can also be interpreted in multiple ways.
Yeah, and just following up from what you're saying, so for people who are teaching history or people who are thinking about history and teaching history to students, right? One of the things which I noticed in my school education, and I'm sure most have noticed that, is that you are given a lot of facts and a lot of dates and a lot of these, like a lot of information which is provided to you, and you're supposed to mug it up and learn it by heart. And then when you go to the exam hall, you're supposed to write it down as much as you remember. Right? Now, what is not taught in this kind of process is a process of reading. We are not taught to read in that sense. And as people from the, you can say, the literary disciplines, right? Our disciplines are more concerned with reading than with, you can say, factual accuracy. So how much do you think that, you can say, historians can take from us a concern with reading, with interpreting, with exegesis of texts? And what would that mean for the historical sciences if we try to focus in the history classroom, not on facts so much, but on developing methods of reading?
Perhaps this is a tool for all of us teachers in the who teach in a classroom, right? The many ways of reading a text, whatever that text may be. It could be a film, it could be an artwork, it could be a history textbook. How do we read it, right? How do we read it critically? How do we read it analytically? These both become very, very important. I mean, at this point, maybe we should also see what are the aids available to a teacher to teach, to read, to analyze, and to engage with it critically. Does a teacher have enough time? Does a teacher get paid enough? Right? Does the teacher get conditions enough for her, mostly her, right, to engage in such a, I don't know, maybe luxurious kind of a manner, engage with the text in a luxurious, because it has become a luxury to engage, sit, read, analyze, write is an act of luxury, right? So can we afford, does the teacher have the aids, means, conditions to do this? So I think that's something which institutions, of course, in this era of privatization and the amount of burden that is on the teacher, I think we just want to rush. So that's one issue that's always been there.
And just to think about it a bit more, when you're talking about this developing process of reading and teaching reading in the history classroom, what would you think about, assigning texts for these students that are not historical texts, that for example, historical fiction or historical narratives, right? Would those be ways, that practical ways perhaps, for teachers to allow students to develop those modes of reading? I mean, of course, those historical fictions and those historical narratives might not be true. They might be giving voices to people who, like, those people never really said those things, or those things really didn't actually happen. But do you think including such, you can say, texts within the history classroom, would that be something that allows students to critically look at history or to imaginatively look at history? Do you think that would be some useful modes of developing a practice of reading within the history classroom?
Absolutely yes. I am reading theory, I read historical texts, quote unquote texts of history, maybe in the last 10 years or so. But until then, my understanding of history has come from fiction. Right? But fiction, like, let me give you two extreme examples. One is historical fiction, quote unquote. Hilary Mantel, do you know this author? She's a British author who has written on Henry the Eighth, but the book is based on Thomas Cromwell, right? Who was in his court, and 3 huge books, fiction. Captivating. That's one kind of historical fiction you can actually use for teaching history. But the other kind of historical fiction, I don't know if we can call it historical fiction, but which will teach you history, is also C.K. Janu. Have you heard her? She's a Adivasi activist from Wayanad, Kerala, whose mother forest talks about the lives, past, future of the people, of her people, Adiyars, right? So these are two very different kinds of texts, which can be classified as fiction, but they're not fictitious, right? So there is a huge difference there. So these things can definitely be used in the classroom. At the same time, we'll maybe after he questions, but I also want to bring in this. It's not just through these kinds of fiction or other texts that we can teach history. My major point which I want to make here today is, how do we bring the histories of the people or the students who are in your classroom, right? So Vidya Vanam, when I looked up Anaikatti, says the website says Anaikatti is populated majorly by 3 tribes: Irular, Kurumbar and Muduga. Am I saying that right? Muduga? Mudugas. So what are the histories of these people? There are no textbooks, or no textbooks mention these histories of these people. How do we bring them in?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question, right? Because a lot of the debates in, you can say, Indian historiography over the last 50 years, which perhaps one of the most dominant schools was the subaltern school of history, subaltern studies group, right? So that debate was structured around the fact of how do you construct a rigorous historical narrative without any real documents that can be located. When you have to work with these traces of documents, with these fragments, with archives that don't exist, with oral narratives, with memory, right? So when it comes to, you're talking about history of people who do not have records, right? And that's what the subaltern studies group called subalterns in that sense. How do you construct that history? Do you construct it in the form of a rigorous, you can say, historical project? Or are you compelled to construct it in a more of a, I wouldn't say fictitious, but more of a literary form, more of an expressive, more artistic? And then what would that do to, you can say, the study of history if you have to teach the history of a people, but through their songs and through their drama or through their music or through their epics, rather than through some fixed historical archival record? And how would we include that within the history classroom?
I think the project of subaltern studies focused on history from the below, but I have a grouse with their method because they still largely looked for written archived record, right? So how do we then include the histories of people which are usually not taught? Again, I would disagree. It's not that there are no records. There are records, but they are not in a format that are familiar to us. That is the problem, right? What are the formats that we are familiar with? We are familiar with libraries, written, archived, either in English or in Hindi or in the state's official language, right? So if it is not in a language that is familiar to us, which is what most quote-unquote smaller people's histories are, not in a language that is familiar to us, then we tend to say that there is no record of this people at all. There is no history of this people at all. So record is not in a form that is accessible to us. So in that sense, I would say yes, when students enter into a classroom, primary school, not necessarily university, and NEP makes this whole fuss about teaching in mother tongue and so on and so forth, right? So my question has always been, what is mother tongue actually? So today when I'm just taking Vidyavanam as an example, it can be anywhere, right? You go to Koraput where Professor Mohanty was Vice Chancellor, or in Hyderabad. In my classroom, in the classroom I teach, I have students speaking Angami, Kashmiri, Balti and Tulu and so on and so forth. So what is the mother tongue that I can access in the class? But since it is higher education, we can ask them to do projects and research work in their languages. But in the smaller classrooms, how do we use this, right? So because NEP says focus on your mother tongue, does it mean we teach them in Tamil? I would have been very, very happy if the invocation song instead of Tamil would have been in Irular, right? Or in Kurumba language. What does it do to a student when your language gets recognized in the school? When you can tell your stories, when you can express your stories. Tamil is not your mother tongue. I mean, I'm happy that Tamil is fighting the fight against Hindi and so on and so forth. You're always there when others are not there, right? But what Tamil nationalism has also done to your own languages is also something that you should reflect. Right? So when they tell you your stories in Irular, it means they're sharing a slice of themselves with you. A sense of identity, a sense of self-respect, which they can relate to and not relate to a Chola king perhaps. So in that sense, it's not just a story, it could be a song, it could be an art form, it could be anything. Right? So mother tongue education should bring in yourself and share it among yourself. Of course, also learn English, also learn Tamil. I'm not saying just learn Irular. Yeah, I am here because I've learned English, right? So you have to, but the burden shouldn't be on these smaller histories. I learn my history, I learn your history, I learn English history, but Tamil people will learn only Tamil history, that's enough. No, right? The burden is always on the minoritized to learn multiple histories, multiple languages. No. All of us will have to learn each other.
Yeah, you're right about the fact that the very concept of record has to be expanded. Like we have at least historians have a very fixed and dogmatic understanding of what constitutes a record, and to expand that would liberate and open up so many different ways of looking at history. But the question that I have for you is that would this not what would be the dangers of at least thinking about these multiple histories if we are locating people within only their own historical worlds? Would that how would one counter that danger?
Yeah, it's become an interview between both of us, right? I'm so
You should also ask him some questions.
maybe you should answer that first and then I can answer. What are the dangers of what I just said? And I will come back to it.
So
anyway.
one of the dangers, which is of course, I think, perhaps at a more like a larger level than at a local level, would be that you start to think of whatever your historical world is as the legitimate and the only authentic historical world, which might work and function very well for minority communities and communities that are oppressed. But we see this kind of language being taken over by even the most dominant, you can say, upper caste communities across the country. That we are the indigenous people of this land and everybody is an outsider. Right? So I think one of the ways to counter this perhaps would be to, instead of looking at your own historical world solely, one can also take a critical perspective on it. But that critical perspective, that might necessitate some you can say connection with, you can say, certain standards and values which are then not just located within one's own world. But then what would those standards and values be? Do we just appeal to these enlightenment notions of liberty and equality and fraternity? Do we appeal to more like religion-centric notions like faith, dharma, deen? What are those values that we need to at the same time hold, while also we can say, centralizing our own modes of historical belonging. Right?
I absolutely agree. I think this idea of multiple histories and native histories has a huge trap, right? This also can be appropriated by very fanatic forces. So how do we deal with it? I mean, I think that is why maybe we can go back to the previous discussion. How do we read a text critically? I mean, for me, reading a text critically or understanding a process critically always means to question the given. Even if it is science, right? You don't proceed to the next experiment unless you question the existing given, whether it is mathematics or sciences. So even in the social sciences, this is the case. So how do we question? The questioning always happens in power relationship. I mean, with regard to power relationship. So these communities have never been isolated. I mean, no communities have lived an isolated life, whether it is caste communities or indigenous tribal communities or different religious communities. They have always interacted with each other. I mean, interacted not in a horizontal plane, but usually in a vertical plane, in the sense of vertical division of power. So when we are talking about these local histories or local expressions, I think it is very essential to think about how these local communities have interacted with other communities, right? And what is it that binds them or ruptures them, or where do they place themselves in relation to other communities? So this question of power, I mean, for younger kids, I know it's very difficult to make them understand power, and also we shouldn't be teaching them in a disillusioned manner, right? But to put it in a manner to show how things can be better. Maybe that's the way we can frame it, how things can be better. So which also shows the power relationship between communities. I mean, it's not just communities, even within a household. And when I say local histories, we should also be very, very careful, like Huzaifa pointed out, because by local histories, I don't mean Kap Panchayats, right? That is also local history and mode of governance. So I'm sure all of you are aware of things like Kap Panchayats. So it is very essential to bring in the idea of power. Kap Panchayats is not just caste power, but is also a patriarchal kind of a power.
And I don't think we have a lot of time, but maybe we can just have a few more points before we open it up to everyone here. Is one of the real fears right now of, I'm sure, anybody who's teaching history in a classroom, whether in a school or whether in a university, is that whatever you might say can be taken up and magnified and amplified, and then lead to either your dismissal from service, or lead to some kind of punitive action from government or extra legal, you can say, organizations, right? So a history teacher is in a certain sense very constrained by this fear. So one thing which is quite difficult for, I'm sure, any teacher at this stage in this country right now